tonight. We drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay, and as we settle into this journey together, I want you to imagine the weight of nearly 6,000 years lifting from your shoulders like morning mist rising from the marshlands of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers snake through reed beds so thick that the horizon disappears into green and gold, and somewhere in that impossibly fertile crescent of earth, in a land the ancients called Sumer, human beings first decided that their thoughts were worth preserving, worth pressing into wet clay with careful reed styluses, worth baking into permanence so that someone, perhaps you, listening in the quiet dark of a distant future age, might one day hear their voices again, and what voices they were, speaking of gods who descended from the heavens, of divine councils that met to decide the fate of the cosmos, of beings called the Anunnaki, whose very name has sparked scholarly arguments, mystical speculation, and more than a few conspiracy theory rabbit holes deep enough to lose yourself in for weeks. But tonight we are not here to chase rabbits, we are here to rest, to let these ancient stories wash over us, like the warm Mesopotamian winds that once carried the scent of date palms and temple incense across the flat alluvial plains. And I should warn you that the world we are entering is strange and wonderful, and occasionally violent in the way that ancient mythologies tend to be. So if you are easily startled by tales of cosmic warfare and divine labor disputes, you probably won't survive this, and I mean that in the gentlest possible way, the way that sleep itself is a small death we practice each night, a surrender to the unknown darkness that somehow always releases us back into morning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because I would rather have a small community of people who truly want to drift off to these strange histories than a million subscribers who clicked by accident while searching for something else entirely. And speaking of community, I always love hearing where you are listening from tonight, whether you are curled up in a bedroom in Berlin, or lying on a couch in California, or perhaps sitting in a parked car in Perth, because home is too noisy for sleeping. Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, you are welcome here. And now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, back through the millennia to a time when the land between the rivers was the center of everything that mattered, when the city of Uruk rose from the marshes with walls so magnificent that later poets would claim the goddess Inanna herself had laid their foundations. And it is here, in the great temple complexes of Sumer, that we find the clay tablets that first mention the Anunnaki, those mysterious divine beings whose name appears again and again in the cuneiform records. And mainstream Sumerian scholarship tells us something fascinating about these tablets, something that sounds almost too convenient to be true, but is thoroughly documented across thousands of fragments. The Sumerians invented writing, not to compose poetry, or record history, or even to send love letters, but to keep track of temple goods, to count how many sheep had been donated to the gods, how many bushels of barley had been stored in the sacred granaries, how many jars of beer, and there was so much beer, the Sumerians absolutely adored beer. They had more words for different types of beer than some modern languages have for snow, had been brewed for religious festivals, and isn't that just perfectly human? That our first permanent records, the oldest writing in human history, were essentially divine grocery lists and tax receipts. I find that oddly comforting. The idea that bureaucracy is so fundamental to civilization that we invented literacy just to make sure nobody was skimming extra barley from the temple stores. Though of course, once writing existed, the Sumerians quickly realized they could use it for other things too. Things like recording the myths and hymns and cosmic origin stories that had been passed down orally for generations. And this is where the Anunnaki enter our story, appearing in texts that describe them as the great gods of heaven and earth, the divine assembly that ruled the cosmos from their celestial courts. And here is where things get interesting, because the name Anunnaki itself has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, with some researchers arguing it means something like princely offspring, or those of royal blood, while others suggest it derives from roots meaning seed of the prince, or possibly those who from heaven came to earth. And this last translation is where the fringe interpretations begin to bubble up like springs in the desert, because once you suggest that the Anunnaki were beings who came from somewhere else, from heaven, from the sky, from beyond the dome of stars that the Sumerians believed enclosed their world like a great inverted bowl, Well, then you open the door to all sorts of creative speculation about ancient astronauts and extraterrestrial visitors, and genetic engineering programs that supposedly created humanity as a slave race to mine gold for reptilian overlords. And I want to be very clear that there is absolutely no credible evidence for any of this in the actual Sumerian texts. The tablets themselves describe the Anunnaki as gods in the religious sense, powerful supernatural beings who control natural forces and demand worship, not as aliens with spacecraft and advanced technology. But I also want to acknowledge that these fringe theories exist and are genuinely believed by millions of people around the world, and there is something almost touching about the human desire to find meaning in ancient mysteries, to believe that our ancestors were visited by beings from beyond the stars, because it suggests that we are not alone in the universe, that someone out there cared enough to come check on us, even if they did apparently put us to work in mines immediately upon arrival, which does not say great things about interstellar labor relations. And now picture yourself standing in one of these ancient Sumerian temples, perhaps the great ziggurat at Nippur, where the god Enlil was worshipped as king of the gods, and the air is thick with incense smoke that curls upward toward painted ceilings depicting stars and cosmic rivers, and priests in white linen robes move through the shadowy halls carrying offerings of bread and beer and the blood of sacrificed lambs, and somewhere in a small chamber off the main sanctuary, a scribe is bent over a clay tablet, pressing his reed stylus into the soft surface with practiced precision, recording a hymn that describes how the Anunnaki first organized the cosmos, how they assigned duties to the various gods, and established the cosmic order that governs everything from the flooding of the rivers to the growth of grain, to the movement of the planets across the night sky. And this scribe has no idea that his work will survive for 5,000 years, that the tablet he is creating tonight will be unearthed by archaeologists in the 19th century, and shipped to a museum in London, or Berlin, or Philadelphia, where scholars will spend decades arguing about what exactly he meant by certain words. And speaking of scholarly arguments, there is a particularly entertaining debate about whether the Anunnaki were originally celestial deities associated with the sky and stars, who later became connected to the underworld, or whether they were always chthonic beings, spirits of the earth and the dead, who somehow got promoted to heavenly status as Sumerian theology evolved. And the evidence genuinely points both ways, which is one of the frustrating and wonderful things about studying ancient Mesopotamia. The records are fragmentary, the language is difficult, and the Sumerians themselves seem to have held multiple contradictory beliefs simultaneously, without any apparent discomfort, much like how modern people can believe in both science and horoscopes without their heads exploding. And I think there is wisdom in that flexibility, that willingness to hold mystery alongside knowledge, to accept that some questions might not have single definitive answers, and as you lie there in the darkness, perhaps you can feel some of that ancient acceptance settling into your bones, the understanding that not everything needs to be resolved tonight, that some mysteries are meant to be companions rather than problems to be solved. And the temple scribe finishes his hymn and sets the tablet aside to dry, and outside the walls of the sacred precinct, the city of Nippur is quieting for the night. Oil lamps flickering in mud brick houses, children being hushed by tired parents, dogs curling up in doorways, and above it all the vast Mesopotamian sky spreads out like a dark blanket, scattered with diamond dust, and somewhere up there, the Sumerians believed, the Anunnaki were watching, those ancient gods, whose names we can still read on clay tablets, that have outlasted empires and civilizations, and everything we thought we knew about human history. And perhaps that is the real magic of Sumer, not ancient astronauts or secret technologies, but the simple astonishing fact that human voices from 50 centuries ago can still reach us, can still tell us stories as we drift toward sleep, and the story the Anunnaki tablets tell is one of cosmic order and divine hierarchy, of gods who worked and argued and loved and made terrible mistakes, of a universe that was alive with supernatural presence, and we are only just beginning to explore it together. So let your breathing slow, and your muscles relax, and your mind release its grip on the waking world, because we have so much more to discover, and the night is long, and the clay tablets are patient, and the Anunnaki are waiting to tell us how they came to this world, and what they did when they arrived. The story the Sumerian tablets tell about the early days of the Anunnaki is one of divine labor and cosmic organization, a vast celestial bureaucracy being established in the time before humans existed, and to understand it properly, we need to imagine a universe that looks nothing like the one modern science describes, because the Sumerians believed that the cosmos was essentially a closed system, a great dome of sky resting on a flat disk of Earth. surrounded on all sides by the primordial waters of chaos, and within this cosmic snow globe, the gods went about their business. And in the beginning, according to the texts recovered from temple archives across Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki gods were divided into two groups: the great gods of heaven, who ruled from above, and the lesser gods who were assigned to work the fields and dig the canals and perform all the heavy labor necessary to keep the cosmos running smoothly. And if this sounds suspiciously like an ancient justification for class hierarchy, well, you are probably not wrong, because one of the things we know for certain about Sumerian society is that it was rigidly stratified, with kings and priests at the top, farmers and craftsmen in the middle, and slaves at the bottom. And the myths the Sumerians told about their gods often reflected and reinforced these social structures, which is either a profound insight into the way religion shapes society, or a deeply cynical manipulation of spiritual beliefs to maintain power, depending on how charitable you are feeling tonight. And I prefer charity, especially at bedtime. So let us assume the Sumerians genuinely believed what they recorded on their tablets, that the universe really did work this way, that some beings were simply meant to rule, and others to serve, and the Anunnaki who came down to Earth in those earliest days were among the ruling class, the great gods who established the first sacred cities in the land of Sumer, and the most important of these cities was Eridu, which the Sumerians believed was literally the first city ever built, the place where civilization began. And modern archaeology has actually found evidence that Eridu is indeed one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in the world, with remains dating back to around 5400 BCE, which is almost incomprehensibly ancient, a time when most of humanity was still living in small villages and hunting camps. And yet here in the marshlands of southern Iraq, people were already building temples and organizing complex societies, and apparently inventing the concept of urban planning. And the god who ruled over Eridu was Enki, one of the most important and frankly most entertaining of the Anunnaki, because unlike the stern sky father Anu, or the sometimes wrathful Enlil, Enki was a trickster figure, a god of wisdom and water and magic, who seemed to genuinely enjoy both creating things and occasionally causing chaos. And the tablets describe how Enki established his great temple at Eridu, the Iabzu, or House of the Cosmic Waters, where fresh water welled up from underground springs that the Sumerians believed connected directly to the primordial ocean of the abyss. And picture this temple now, rising from the flat marshlands like a mountain made by human hands, its mud brick walls painted in brilliant blues and reds, its courtyards filled with pools of sacred water where fish swam in lazy circles, and inside, in the Holy of Holies, stood a statue of Enki himself, covered in gold and precious stones, receiving the prayers and offerings of priests who believed they were communicating directly with the divine intelligence that had organized the cosmos. And the fringe theorists have had an absolute field day with Enki, because he is described in the tablets as the god who later creates humanity, who possesses secret knowledge, who sometimes acts against the wishes of the other gods to help mortals. And if you squint at these stories through the lens of ancient astronaut theory, Enki starts to look like a rogue scientist, a Prometheus figure, who broke protocol to uplift primitive humanity. And I have to admit that interpretation does make for a good story, even if there is no actual evidence for it, beyond the willingness to read extraterrestrial implications into every ancient text that mentions gods coming from the sky, which is essentially all of them, because gods living in the sky is just what gods do in most mythologies. It is not exactly smoking gun evidence of alien visitation, but try telling that to someone who has watched all 7 seasons of Ancient Aliens, and developed a comprehensive theory about reptilian overlords and their gold mining operations. And speaking of entertaining theories, there is a scholarly debate that has been going on for decades about the relationship between the Sumerian Anunnaki and the later Mesopotamian traditions that evolved among the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, because while these cultures inherited much of Sumerian mythology, they also changed it in significant ways, and some scholars argue that the Anunnaki underwent a kind of theological demotion over time, shifting from the great gods of heaven to spirits of the underworld, associated with the dead and the dark places beneath the earth, while others contend that the Anunnaki were always primarily chthonic beings, and that the heavenly associations were added later, and still others suggest that we are making too much of categorical distinctions that the ancient Mesopotamians themselves might not have recognized, because their religious thinking was fluid and comfortable with contradiction in ways that modern Western logic sometimes struggles to accommodate. And I find this debate genuinely fascinating. The idea that even the experts cannot agree on something as fundamental as whether these gods were originally from above or below, from light or darkness, from sky or earth, and perhaps that ambiguity is the point. Perhaps the Anunnaki were always meant to be liminal beings, dwelling at the threshold between worlds. And now let us move to the city of Nippur, where the god Enlil held court, because if Eridu was the oldest city, Nippur was the religious capital of Sumer, the place where the fates of kings and nations were determined, and Enlil was the king of the gods in most Sumerian texts, the one whose word was law, whose breath was the wind, whose anger could flatten cities like wheat before a storm, and the temples at Nippur were the most important religious institutions in all of Mesopotamia for thousands of years, and even after the Sumerians themselves faded from history, absorbed into the Akkadian and Babylonian empires that followed, Nippur remained sacred, a pilgrimage site that drew worshippers from across the ancient world, and the clay tablets recovered from Nippur form the backbone of our knowledge about Sumerian religion. Thousands upon thousands of fragments describing rituals and hymns and myths, and the great cosmic dramas in which the Anunnaki played their parts. And one of the most important of these myths describes a time of crisis among the gods, a moment when the lesser Anunnaki, who had been laboring to maintain the cosmos, finally reached their breaking point. And this is where our story starts to get really interesting, because the tablets describe these working gods as exhausted, overwhelmed, pushed beyond endurance by the endless toil of digging canals and building temples and growing food for the great gods above. And if you have ever worked a job that made you feel like a small cog in an enormous uncaring machine, you might find yourself sympathizing with these divine laborers, these gods who looked up at their superiors, enjoying leisure and luxury, and decided that enough was enough. And the tablets tell us that the lesser gods staged what can only be described as a divine strike, a cosmic labor action in which they refused to continue working and demanded that something be done to ease their burden. And this is genuinely remarkable. The idea that 5,000 years ago Sumerian priests were telling stories about gods who organized against their oppressors, who refused to accept their lot in the cosmic hierarchy, who stood up and said no more. And of course the outcome of this divine strike was not better working conditions, or shorter hours, or a divine minimum wage. The outcome was us, humanity, created specifically to take over the work that the lesser gods refused to do any longer, which is either a profound meditation on the nature of human existence, or a deeply pessimistic statement about our place in the cosmic order, depending on how you look at it. And as the night deepens and your thoughts grow softer and more diffuse, you might let that idea settle into your mind without judging it. The possibility that ancient peoples looked at the hard labor of human life, the endless work of farming and building and surviving, and told themselves a story that made sense of it all. A story in which even the gods had to work, even the gods grew tired, even the gods needed help, and maybe that story was comforting in its own strange way. The knowledge that toil was not a punishment unique to mortals but a cosmic necessity, baked into the very fabric of existence, and the cities of Sumer grew and flourished under the watchful eyes of the Anunnaki, Ura with its great ziggurat, and its prosperous trading ports, Lagash with its warrior kings and its detailed records of temple administration, Uruk with its legendary walls and its connection to Inanna, goddess of love and war and everything complicated about being alive, and in all these cities the same basic mythology held sway, the same stories about the Anunnaki and their works, the same rituals designed to keep the gods happy and the cosmic order stable, and the priests who tended these temples believed they were participating in something eternal, something that would continue forever, and of course nothing continues forever. Empires rise and fall, languages die and are forgotten, gods are worshipped and then abandoned to dust and memory, but somehow the clay tablets survived, buried under the ruins of collapsed temples, preserved by the dry Iraqi soil for millennia, until archaeologists arrived with their brushes and their notebooks and their burning curiosity about what these strange wedge-shaped marks might mean. And now those tablets sit in museums around the world, still telling their stories to anyone patient enough to listen. And tonight we are listening, you and I together in the darkness, hearing the echoes of voices so ancient they might as well be from another world entirely. And in a way they are, because the world of Sumer is gone beyond recovery. We can study it, but we cannot visit it. We can read the words, but we cannot hear the voices that first spoke them. And yet something survives. Something crosses the vast gulf of time. Something connects us to those long-dead scribes and priests and kings who first pressed reed into clay and wrote the names of the Anunnaki. And that connection is worth something, worth staying awake for just a little longer, worth following deeper into the story before sleep finally claims you. The creation of humanity, according to the Sumerian tablets, was not an act of love or divine generosity, but a practical solution to an administrative crisis. And as we ease deeper into this ancient story, let your body sink further into whatever surface supports you. Let your hands go limp, and your jaw unclench, and your eyes drift closed or half closed, whatever feels natural, because the tale we are about to explore is strange and beautiful, and a little bit disturbing in the way that all origin stories tend to be when you examine them closely. And the tablets recovered from sites like Nippur and Sippar, and the great library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, describe how the great Anunnaki gods gathered in council to address the problem of the rebellious lesser gods, those divine laborers who had thrown down their tools and refused to continue the endless work of maintaining creation. And the solution proposed by Enki, that clever trickster god of wisdom and water, was to create a new being, a creature made from clay mixed with divine essence, something that could work as the gods once worked, but without the divine spark that made the lesser gods capable of rebellion. And this is genuinely one of the most important mainstream facts we can draw from Sumerian religion. The idea that humanity was created to serve the gods, to perform the labor necessary for cosmic maintenance. And this belief was not unique to the Sumerians. It appears in various forms throughout Mesopotamian civilization, and influenced later religious traditions in ways we are still tracing. And the tablets describe the actual creation process, with surprising specificity, naming the goddess Ninmah, or Ninhursag, as the divine midwife, who shaped the first humans from clay, while Enki provided the animating divine element. And in some versions of the myth, this divine element is the blood of a slain god, a rebellious deity, who was sacrificed so that his essence could be mixed with the clay to create beings capable of both work and worship. And if that sounds vaguely familiar, if it reminds you of other stories about divine beings, whose death enables human life, well, you are not alone in noticing those parallels. Scholars have spent careers tracing the connections between Mesopotamian creation myths and the traditions that emerged later in the region, including the Hebrew traditions that eventually became the biblical book of Genesis. And this brings us to one of the fringe interpretations that has captured popular imagination, the idea that the Anunnaki creation of humanity was actually a genetic engineering project, an alien intervention designed to create a worker species by mixing extraterrestrial DNA with primitive hominid stock. And I want to be very clear that this interpretation requires ignoring basically everything we know about how ancient mythologies work, about how cultures create meaning through symbolic narrative, about the complete absence of any archaeological evidence for advanced technology in ancient Mesopotamia. But I also want to acknowledge that this interpretation exists and is believed by sincere people who find in it a narrative that makes sense of human existence, a story about our origins that feels more concrete and scientific than the spiritual alternatives. And there is something almost poignant about that, the human need for origin stories, so strong that we will rewrite ancient myths to fit modern technological frameworks rather than sit with the mystery of not knowing where we came from or why we are here. And the scholarly debate around the creation myths focuses on different questions entirely. Questions about textual relationships and theological evolution, and the social functions of religious narrative. And one particularly interesting debate concerns whether the Sumerian creation myths influenced the biblical account in Genesis, or whether both traditions drew independently from a common ancient, Near Eastern mythological pool. And the evidence suggests the answer is complicated, that there was definitely influence and borrowing, but also innovation and transformation, that the Hebrew writers who composed Genesis were aware of Mesopotamian traditions, but were also doing something new with them, reimagining the relationship between the divine and the human in ways that would eventually shape the entire course of Western civilization. And speaking of civilization, the creation myths also tell us something important about how the Sumerians understood the purpose of human life, because if we were created to serve the gods, then service becomes not just a duty, but a cosmic function, the very reason for our existence. And the tablets describe how the newly created humans were put to work immediately, digging canals and farming fields, and building temples, and producing the offerings that the gods required, and the gods themselves retired to a life of leisure, receiving the fruits of human labor, without having to lift a divine finger. Which honestly sounds like a pretty sweet deal for them, and a rather raw one for us. But the Sumerians do not seem to have resented this arrangement, or at least the priests who wrote the tablets did not express any resentment. They accepted their place in the cosmic hierarchy, with what appears to be genuine faith, believing that by serving the gods, they were fulfilling their created purpose and maintaining the order of the universe. And there is something almost admirable in that acceptance. Even as modern sensibilities recoil from it, the willingness to find meaning in service, to believe that one's labor matters to powers greater than oneself, and as you lie there in the darkness, perhaps you can feel how different that worldview is from the one we inhabit today, where meaning is something we are supposed to create for ourselves, where purpose is a personal quest rather than a cosmic assignment. And I am not saying the Sumerian view was better, I am just noting how strange it feels from our perspective, how alien and yet how human, the universal need for significance dressed in unfamiliar clothes. And the tablets describe the early days of humanity, with a mixture of creation mythology and what might be called etiological storytelling, explanations for why things are the way they are, why humans must work so hard, why we grow old and die, why there is suffering in the world, and the answers the Sumerians gave to these questions were embedded in their stories about the Anunnaki, about the divine decisions that shaped human fate. And some of these stories are funny in unexpected ways, like the tale of how Enki got drunk at a feast and started giving away divine powers and privileges to the goddess Inanna, only to regret it terribly when he sobered up, which is both a cosmic origin story and a cautionary tale about alcohol that probably resonated with every Sumerian who ever woke up, with a hangover and a vague sense of having made promises they could not keep. And humor like this reminds us that the people who created these myths were people just like us, prone to the same foolishness and the same wisdom, capable of imagining gods who were also capable of both. And the image of a divine being nursing a hangover while the goddess of love and war makes off with stolen cosmic powers is frankly delightful. A reminder that ancient mythology is not all doom and gravitas, that the Sumerians could laugh at their gods even as they worshipped them. And another funny story involves Enki and Ninmah getting into a competition about creation, with Ninmah making increasingly defective humans, and Enki finding roles for each of them in society, until Enki creates a being so helpless that Ninmah cannot find any useful function for it at all. And this story might be about disability and social inclusion, or it might be about the limits of divine creativity, or it might just be a drinking game that got out of hand. Because both gods are described as quite intoxicated during this competition, and the Sumerians clearly enjoyed stories about their gods behaving badly, about divine dignity being compromised by very human weaknesses, and perhaps these stories made the gods more approachable, more understandable, less terrifying in their otherness, and the temples where these stories were told must have been filled with both reverence and laughter, both awe and affection, a relationship with the divine that was complex and textured and alive in ways that our modern categories of sacred and profane struggle to capture. And the clay tablets preserve these stories with the same matter-of-fact recording style they used for everything else. Tax receipts and cosmic creation myths, treated with the same attention to detail, the same careful pressing of stylus into clay, the same assumption that this information was worth preserving for future generations, and the future generations they imagined were probably their own descendants. Other Sumerians who would continue the traditions and tend the temples and serve the gods. They could not have imagined us lying in the dark thousands of years later, listening to their stories as we drift towards sleep, and yet here we are, the inheritors of their words, the audience they never anticipated, and the Anunnaki gods they described are still here too, in a way preserved in clay, waiting to be read, waiting to tell us about the time, before humans walked the earth, before the world was complicated by mortality and labor and all the beautiful, terrible weight of being alive. And as your breathing slows and your thoughts grow dreamlike and diffuse, let the ancient words settle around you like a blanket, like a blessing, like the warm Mesopotamian wind that once carried the voices of priests chanting to gods whose names we can still speak, Anu and Enlil, and Enki and Ninmah, the Anunnaki who shaped the world and us within it. And whatever you believe about origins, whatever scientific or spiritual framework houses your understanding, there is room for wonder. There is room for the ancient mystery that drew the first humans to look up at the stars and ask, where do we come from, and why are we here, and what does it all mean? The great flood that nearly destroyed humanity appears in Sumerian tablets, far older than the biblical account we know so well, and as we drift deeper into the night and deeper into this ancient story, let the tension in your shoulders release and the thoughts in your mind slow to a gentle current, because we are approaching the climax of our tale, the moment when everything almost ends, and somehow does not, and the tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal and from sites throughout Mesopotamia tell us that the gods, The Anunnaki, who had created humanity as their servants, eventually grew tired of their creation, annoyed by the noise and chaos and sheer proliferation of mortal life, and the god Enlil, stern king of the divine assembly, decided that humanity must be destroyed, wiped from the earth like a failed experiment. And this is one of the most important mainstream facts about Mesopotamian religion, the existence of a flood narrative that predates the biblical account by at least a millennium, discovered on cuneiform tablets that archaeologists translated in the 19th century, causing considerable theological controversy among Victorian Christians who had believed their flood story was unique and original. And the Sumerian version of the flood hero is sometimes called Ziusudra, while later Akkadian and Babylonian versions call him Utnapishtim or Atrahasis. And the basic structure of the story is remarkably consistent across these variants. A righteous man is warned by a god that a great flood is coming. He builds a boat. He saves his family and animals. The waters recede. He makes sacrifices, and he is granted immortality or divine favor as a reward. And if this sounds exactly like the story of Noah, that is because the biblical authors were almost certainly aware of the Mesopotamian tradition and adapted it for their own theological purposes, which is not a criticism, but simply an acknowledgement of how religious narratives work, how they travel and transform and accumulate meaning as they pass from culture to culture. And the fringe interpretation of the flood story is predictably dramatic, suggesting that the deluge was not divine punishment, but some kind of global catastrophe, perhaps caused by a comet impact, or the collapse of an ice dam, or the deliberate action of extraterrestrial beings who had grown dissatisfied with their human experiment. And while there is no credible evidence for any of these scenarios in the actual texts or in the geological record, the persistence of flood myths across many different cultures has led some to speculate that there might be a kernel of historical truth, buried somewhere in the mythological elaboration, perhaps a memory of the catastrophic flooding that accompanied the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose dramatically and coastal communities would have experienced devastating inundation. And this brings us to a scholarly debate that has occupied Mesopotamian studies for decades: the question of whether the Sumerian flood narrative preserves any historical memory or is purely mythological, and the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. There are flood deposits at some Mesopotamian archaeological sites, but they date to different periods and do not show evidence of a single catastrophic region-wide event. And most scholars today believe the flood stories are primarily theological rather than historical, narratives about divine judgment and mercy rather than reports of actual events. But the debate continues because the question touches on something fundamental about how we understand ancient texts, whether they can ever be read as straightforward historical testimony, or whether their meanings are always shaped by cultural and religious contexts that transform raw experience into symbolic narrative. And the flood story in its Sumerian version focuses heavily on the relationship between the gods themselves, particularly the tension between Enlil, who wants humanity destroyed, and Enki, who wants to save at least a remnant. And this is where Enki's role as trickster and protector of humanity becomes most apparent, because he cannot directly disobey Enlil's command to keep the plan secret. So instead, he speaks to a reed wall behind which the hero Ziusudra or Utnapishtim happens to be listening, technically not revealing the secret to a human being, while ensuring that the human being learns it anyway. And this divine loophole, this clever circumvention of the letter of the law, while violating its spirit, is so perfectly Enki, so perfectly characteristic of the god who always finds a way to accomplish what he wants without accepting direct responsibility. And there is something almost loyally about it, something that suggests the Sumerians were well acquainted with the creative interpretation of rules long before modern contract law made an art of it. And the human hero follows the instructions he overhears, building a boat according to divine specifications, gathering his family and animals, sealing the vessel with pitch and bitumen, and then the rains come, the tablets describing waters pouring from the sky and surging up from below, the cosmic boundaries collapsing as the primordial chaos that surrounds creation breaks through the barriers that normally hold it back. And for 7 days and 7 nights the storm rages, and when it finally subsides, the hero opens a hatch and sees only water, endless water stretching to every horizon, and he sends out birds to find dry land, a dove that returns, a swallow that returns, and finally a raven that does not return, signaling that somewhere out there the earth is emerging from the flood, and the boat comes to rest on a mountain, and the hero makes offerings to the gods, burning sweet resin and meat, and the gods gather around the sacrifice like flies around a carcass. The tablets say, hungry for worship after days without offerings. And this image is both comical and profound. The great Anunnaki gods reduced to buzzing around a barbecue because they had forgotten that without humans there would be no one to feed them, no one to tend their temples, no one to speak their names, and in this moment the relationship between gods and mortals is revealed as mutual dependence rather than simple hierarchy. The gods need us as much as we need them. We are not just their servants but their sustenance, the source of the worship and sacrifice that sustains divine existence. And Enlil is furious when he realizes that humanity has survived, that his plan for total annihilation has been thwarted, but eventually he is reconciled to the new situation, accepting that some humans will continue to exist and serve the gods, and the flood hero is rewarded with immortality, transported to a distant paradise at the edge of the world where he will live forever, exempt from the mortality that defines human existence. And this is a fascinating theological move, the creation of an exception that proves the rule. One human who escapes death to demonstrate just how final death is for everyone else. And the later epic of Gilgamesh, that great Babylonian masterpiece that includes the flood narrative as an episode, uses this contrast brilliantly, with the hero Gilgamesh seeking out Utnapishtim to learn the secret of immortality, only to discover that it is not available to him, that he must accept his mortality and find meaning in the brief span of human life. And speaking of finding meaning, here is another joke from the Mesopotamian tradition, though whether it is intentionally funny or just unintentionally hilarious is hard to say. After the flood, when Enlil has finally accepted that humanity will survive, he complains about the noise humans make, the racket of mortal life that disturbs divine peace, and the solution the gods arrive at is to introduce death and infertility and disease, various mechanisms to keep the human population in check, and thus reduce the overall volume of human complaint and celebration, and all the other sounds of being alive, which means that according to this mythology, we die because we were too loud. Mortality is cosmic noise reduction, and I find that oddly charming. The idea that death is just the universe's way of turning down the volume, and as the night deepens and sleep draws closer, perhaps that thought can sit with you gently. The ancient explanation for mortality, that does not pretend to be anything other than mythological, that makes no claim to scientific accuracy, but offers instead a story, a way of thinking about the great mystery of why we do not last forever, and the Anunnaki who survived the flood, who gathered around that first sacrifice like hungry flies. They continued to rule over humanity for ages afterward, according to the tablets presiding over the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, receiving worship in temples that rose and fell, and rose again, as empires succeeded one another, and eventually even the gods seem to have faded, their temples abandoned, their names forgotten by all but a handful of scholars who puzzle over clay tablets in museum basements. And yet here we are, still telling their stories, still speaking of Anu and Enlil, and Enki, and the great assembly of the Anunnaki, and perhaps in some small way that speaking keeps them alive, keeps their stories moving through time like the rivers that once watered the land of Sumer. And your breathing now is slow and deep, your body heavy with approaching sleep, and the ancient world is close tonight, closer than it usually feels, the voices of the long dead whispering across millennia. And so we come to the end of our journey through the clay tablets of Sumer, through the stories of the Anunnaki and their works, and as you lie here in the comfortable darkness, hovering between waking and sleep, perhaps you can feel how strange it is that we know any of this at all, that voices speaking 5,000 years ago can still reach us, still tell us about gods who descended from heaven and created humanity from clay, still ask the same questions we ask about meaning and mortality, and our place in the vast indifferent cosmos, and whether you find the mainstream scholarly interpretation compelling, or whether the fringe theories spark something in your imagination, the simple fact remains that human beings have always told stories to make sense of their existence, have always looked up at the stars and wondered, have always pressed their thoughts into whatever medium was available, clay tablets or papyrus scrolls or digital signals pulsing through the night, and the Anunnaki as the Sumerians understood them were not ancient astronauts or reptilian overlords, but something perhaps more interesting, gods who worked and rested, who created and destroyed, who made mistakes and found solutions, who were powerful beyond human comprehension, and yet also strangely familiar in their petty jealousies and grand ambitions. And there is something comforting in that familiarity, the knowledge that even the divine beings our ancestors imagined were recognizably like us in their essential nature. And tonight as sleep takes you, perhaps you can carry with you a fragment of that ancient world, an image of reed marshes stretching to the horizon, of ziggurats rising from flat plains, of scribes pressing stylus into clay by lamplight, of priests chanting in smoke-filled temples to gods whose names we can still pronounce: Anu the Sky Father, Enlil the Storm King, Enki the Clever One, Inanna the Fierce and Beautiful, and all the great assembly of the Anunnaki, watching over a world that no longer exists except in fragments, in tablets, in stories we tell each other in the darkness. And thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to these ancient echoes, for letting the old words wash over you as you drift toward rest. And if you enjoyed this journey and would like to take more such journeys in nights to come, remember to subscribe and perhaps share this with someone else who might appreciate a gentle history lesson at bedtime. And now let your eyes close fully if they have not already. Let your thoughts dissolve into the soft static of pre-sleep consciousness. Let the rivers of Mesopotamia carry you downstream toward whatever dreams await. And know that somewhere in the deep past, scribes are still writing, gods are still watching, and the great mystery of existence is still unfolding as it always has, patient and eternal, and utterly unconcerned with our small human need to understand it, which is perhaps the most comforting thought of all, that the universe will keep its secrets regardless of how hard we try to uncover them. And that is okay, that is more than okay, that is the way things are, and you can rest now, you can let go, you can drift into whatever gentle darkness awaits, carrying with you the oldest words ever pressed into clay, and the stories they still tell are to anyone willing to listen. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be touched by starlight and ancient wonder. End of script. Sweet dreams.